Hello, everyone. Anin bozu memengwe kwen Indigenous kabiskiga mangindoje ba makwendo dem. My name is Emily McKinney, and I'll be your host for August National Center for Truth and Reconciliation Dialogue of 2021. The NCTR Dialogue series began in the summer of 2020 to continue the center's work of spreading awareness and educating the public in a virtual format. Starting in June last year, three NCTR dialogues were held to discuss topics such as the LGBTQ two spirit perspectives on the calls to action, Indigenous youth perspectives of the calls to action. In today's dialogue, we will be exploring the treaty relationship in treaties number 1 and 2 and what that means for the future Indigenous peoples in Manitoba. Personally, I believe it's a really great topic to discuss, considering that we just recently had the Treaty 150th commemorations for both Treaty 1 and Treaty 2 this month. Today, we are joined by Allen Sutherland, White Spotted Horse, Christy Anderson, and Marlene Gallagher. Allen, would you please introduce yourself for us?
Thank you. Wapski Minnesizet Misatem na cause, the Juni do them, Ishponaning donji, Treaty 2 territory, Nishnaway ni. I'm White Spotted Horse. My common name is Allen Sutherland. I'm from Scowen First Nations of Treaty 2 and from the Lynx clan, Nishnaway.
Nice to meet you, Allen. Christy, introduce yourself for us.
Bonjour, Christy Anderson, Indigenous ni na mahikan indo dem panimutang indochi. Sorry for my very beginner Anishinaabe. My name is Christy Anderson. I am from Panimutang First Nation and I'm of the Wolf Clan. I'm also a PhD student at the University of Saskatchewan in Indigenous Studies. Great to be here.
Wow, that's great. I always like to say that it's a long life. As Anishinaabes, as any Indigenous people, it's a long life learning just to be fluent in our native tongue languages, right? Compared to like English, there's 1,000 ways where you can say one sentence in our native tongue languages. Marlene, did you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, Marlene Gallagher, Indigenous, Makwatodum, Saging Ginitawigis. I'm Marlene Gallagher. I'm from the Bear Clan and I'm from Saging First Nation, which is signatory to Treaties 1 and 3 and Miigwech and
Yes, thank you, Marlene. We're so happy to have you here. So, for the first part, we're going to start a discussion. And I have a couple questions here. So, feel free to answer any of the following questions. And it's in regards of the future of the treaty relationship within the next 150 years. So, here's the first question. How has the treaty relationship changed within your lifetime? Allen, did you wanna answer this question?
Sure. I understand I got 5 minutes, so I'll try to convey a lifetime in it. For growing up in a small community of Scowen First Nation and going through the school systems, we didn't have our history. We didn't have anything about treaty or how this country was developed. But one thing we did have was treaty days, and every year they will come by a boat. Somebody will be wearing a red serge, that's the Mountie, and then there was be a government bureaucrat that's going to give me my $5 so I can go to the store later and buy candy. That was the beginning in saying, why? Why are they doing this? Grandpa, why are they doing this? Because they have to, he said. Later on, as I went through the school system, so we never learned about treaties until I went to university, and then they had an introduction to it, not too much. But it was enough to go back for me to go home and to ask a lot of questions what I have learned in that university. It only took 1 year. That was the beginning of my learning about history and talking to those that were talking about treaties. Those treaties for me really began in 1996 when one of my mentors who's passed on now is Roy Hockwitz, that took me under his wing and told me everything about treaty. Later on, at the same year, I was able to meet with the then chief, Dennis Whitebird, who eventually become TRCM, the Treaty Relations Commission's treaty commissioner. Now, he was the lone voice in the wilderness, talking about the importance of treaties, because back then, in the mid-90s, what was treaties anyway? Everybody bought into the fact that we sold our rights for trinkets and farming equipment, and that's it. That was the message that we learned from society, that we ceded, yielded, and surrendered our rights. But he was a lone voice that says to the chiefs, he said, treaty is everything. Roy Hockwitz says, that is your identity. And he kept on saying, we never sold anything off. We were generous. We shared the land. And that's why it was a long evolution to where we are today, to give that message out that we're all treaty people. It's very important to understand that treaties is a living entity. It's a living agreement between the newcomers that said that we come to live with you. And it was through our generosity as Anishinaabe people that says there's plenty of room in the garden, but there's condition. We just celebrated, we wouldn't say celebrated, but Canadians could celebrate. We honored Treaty 1 and 2 just recently last weekend on August 20 and 21st for Treaty 2. It's a solemn event to remind us that there's a lot of work that needs to be done, because in our treaties, it does not say anything about giving away our land or natural resources or anything. It was very straightforward from the Crown. We are asking you, could you share your land and we'll compensate you. For every land taken up, we'll pay for that. Now, speeding up to what's going on today, after 150 years, it's a solemn event, because to us in Treaty 2, there are 16 unsettled promises. And we ended up being wards of Canada even to this very day. As long as the Indian Act still exists, we're still wards of Canada. And it's very important to understand that, because the bill is up. We have the bill. We want to be part of your federal provincial systems. It doesn't necessarily have to be on Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution, but we want to be equal the way our ancestors have set it up. And here's the bill. So anyway, it's evolving to a point now that most Canadians are starting to realize the fact that we must look at the spirit and intent of that treaty, really understand who we are as Canadians.
That's you really provided us a lot of knowledge, and it really what really intrigued me, it really sparked me, because I started learning about treaties in 2018 when I was 17 years old, and I'm 20 now. And one thing too, it's like that I just want to comment, or even ask you a question myself, is like, you didn't start learning about treaties until you got to university, until you were considered an adult. So do you think, like, it grew as a passion because it felt like you kind of missed out, or how is something so important that involves our inherent in treaty rights, our rights as a person, and how it protects the land and all, and all these great things, protects our ceremonies, like how are these not taught in our communities, even first and foremost during the treaty celebrations? Like, is that what kind of like fueled your passion towards learning about treaties?
It fueled my passion, was to say, why are we under this Indian Act? And when I'm going to our communities, like my grandparents that raised me, the people that raised me in my small community, had no idea what the Indian Act is. All they just know is their relationship with the Indian agent. So now I have a wealth of questions to ask them. So the connection from my generations to their generations was opening up, and they were filling in the gaps.
And let's start off where we left off. So I had asked Alan, how did his passion grew onto treaties? Like if it was, like in regards to myself, like I'm 20 years old and I started learning about treaties in 2018 when I was 17 years old. And to me, like I connected with Alan when he said that he first started learning about treaties when he went to university. And I had mentioned a comment too in regards of how, how when it comes to treaties, right, it deals with our rights, our inherent rights, our treaty rights, and it protects our ceremonies as well as the land, and many other things such as sovereign to education and even our governance. But I wanted to ask Alan, how did his passion grew within when learning about treaties in university?
Naturally, when a young person starts learning about their history, and then along the way they learn their treaties, they'll learn about Indian residential schools. They'll learn about the impact that Indian Affairs and Indian Act have done to us during the colonization period. Young people will automatically be very angry for hearing this for the first time, and they want to do something. Well, that's where naturally you go through all those stages. It's almost like the 5 stages of grieving that ones have to go through in terms of accepting the truth of what took place in Canada to all of us as Canadians. So for me, being young, I want to do something. And for me to do something was to me to learn more about it. So I was connecting with my grandparents and that generation because it was a generational interrupt. Our culture, our ceremonies, we and I guess it's been prophesied that they too will be the sleeping elders. Now we're approaching them, asking them about all these things. Now we're opening up the flow of that history to the next generation. For me, I just picked up and I knew that was my purpose to learn everything about us, especially when it comes to our history and that treaty relationship that we have with Canada.
Thank you for that answer, Alan. You really have I really like your spirit, and I really like how how you talk about treaties, how you really focus on the intent and the spirit of treaty. When the treaty was made, when they had that celebrations, that week-long celebrations, there is our ancestors smoke their pipes. Our pipe ceremonies were in we're involved in the treaty agreements, and it created a treaty spirit, right? And anyways, we're gonna carry on with Marlene. Marlene, would you like to answer this question? How has the treaty relationship changed within your lifetime?
Sure. Well, I think for me, first of all, it's when you go back and think about what did we learn in school. And I know for myself in particular, anything I did learn was very singular. It was always from the Crown's perspective, and it's like First Nations people didn't have a perspective in any of this because anything you read about or learned about was from the Crown's perspective. So there was very little awareness about First Nations people. I mean, a lot of people probably didn't even know how many different groups are in Canada, for one thing. But I think the one thing is, when you start by acknowledging First Nations people's beliefs, right? We have to, understand that piece of history, that we have a culture, we had our own languages, and we have that way of life that we had since, long before I was ever born, but yet that way of life existed for me and, with my family. And so, we have to have that balance with the treaties as well in that relationship. We have to understand both sides of the story. It can't be just one-sided because otherwise, how do you work on that relationship if it's one-sided? So the intent of treaties was really for both parties, to collaborate, to work together, and so that we could coexist in a good way. And I mean, and for Indigenous people, we always talk about, minopimataziwin, which is a good way of living. And that wasn't the case for a lot of our communities. I I heard about treaties and different things, when I was younger. But yes, for sure, I didn't learn more about it till I was much older. And I remember even in high school, I was taking a history class, and my teacher started talking about residential schools, for example. And so I put my hand up and I said, well, that's actually not accurate. And so I was trying to share what residential schools were about because I had attended residential schools for 5 years. I was actually kicked out of class because what did I know about this, right? So that was fine with me because at least I thought, well, I tried to correct, a piece of history and what my classmates were learning, even though it didn't work. And I thought, well, that's fine. I at least voiced my concern in what was being taught. So the other thing, I guess, that stands out for me in my lifetime is, if you look back historically to the 60s, 70s, into the 80s, even, there was resistance, there was conflict in our treaty relationship, you know, so there was assimilation going on. I'm part of the residential school era, but I'm also part of the 60s scoop where, you know, I was part of a system that was created by the government, and that still impacts us today. So, when you're talking about a good relationship, you have to understand that piece as well. And a lot of people don't, and I think the one way that we can address some of this is what we do at the Treaty Relations Commission, and that is through education. We have a complete education unit. We're looking at, embedding the treaties, residential schools, all those pieces of history into curriculum. Unfortunately, it's not mandatory at this point. I would like to see it being mandatory as, a person that works in the education system. But again, that's something we can work on for the future. And, when I talked about the resistance and the conflict. I mean, if you look back to the white paper that was brought out in 1969, that was actually about getting rid of our rights and, of course, our treaties. So that would have had a profound effect because when you look at treaties, they are legal, like Alan said earlier, they're living, breathing documents that should be honored. And so for me, that's a big thing. And again, when you look at some of our organizations that, have been established over time, a lot of these things weren't happening until the 70s and 80s. So you have AFN that was established, in the early 80s. In fact, our first treaty commissioner in Canada wasn't Indigenous, and that was in 1989 or around that time period. So that person wasn't Indigenous, but now our commissioners are all Indigenous. So again, it's showing where we are moving forward and we need to just continue this work. And I think it's important for us to remember that history, but I also think it's important for it to be taught in schools. And so that, all the following subsequent generations are going to know what happened with this history and have a better understanding of who we are as Indigenous people. Because when I talk to different groups, a lot of them are quite surprised with the history because they just don't know. And so, that's something for me that's been a passion, is to teach those pieces of history, whether it's, at grade 6 or at the university level, or just going to newcomer agencies where the people want to learn who are Indigenous people. We hear about them, but we don't know anything about them. So I'm glad I'm able to do that through the Treaty Relations Commission and go out, and bring that piece of history and firsthand stories of what has happened within our communities.
Thank you, Marlene, for your words. Honestly, like if you think about treaties is our treaty relationship is with the crown. We are first level governance. Therefore, our treaty rights, the treaty agreement is first level governance, right? It's higher than the federal government. It's higher than the provincial, than the municipality. Therefore, it should be mandatory that we learn about treaties in schools, in all education institutions, because of that first level governance, because it deals with so many things, our natural resources, even our sovereignty and everything, how we're able to have the right to even to have a lake to beside our community, so it's not being sucked up by these mass corporations. It deals with our land, our right to hunt, our resources. And I definitely agree with you on so many levels. And I think, from what I understand, because I'm a youth myself, right? Like I haven't been around for too long. Just kidding. But a lot of times when I talk with people, they always tell me, the one side, the settler side of treaty. They don't talk about the spirit and intent, or even how, even with Treaty 6, I've heard stories from elders from Treaty 6 territory, when I was over there, and they said that they used when it came to the when the settlers used to extinct the buffalo race, and they would corner our people, and our people would starve, and they would have to boil their moccasins in order to make moccasins, to boil their moccasins to get the nutrients out of the hides so that they could eat. That needs to be talked about too, right? A lot of not everyone wanted to sign treaties. No. But oftentimes we had no choice. It was forced upon, right? So what I think about it is that we had a plate full of resources. We had everything that we needed to survive, right? But now, to me, from what I believe, or what I'm thinking, and I could be wrong. There could be different ideologies and perspective too. Like I'm still learning about treaties as well. But something that I want to say is that when you think about treaties, think about it's what we have left of being sovereign, of having our right to live freely, not under these laws and policies, and how we're supposed to stay in line and follow all these mandated agendas, how we don't have the ability to freely have powwows or our ceremonies, right? Without if we were under fourth level governance.
Yeah, for sure. And a lot of things like that were banned. And I mean, I remember like Allen, going to treaty days, and, it was like, what are we celebrating? And, asking those questions. And a lot of times in our communities, people really didn't talk about why. And I think part of assimilation worked in the sense that we didn't talk openly about, some of the reasons why. And I mean, the Indian Act itself has had such an impact on us, going back to the beginning to now, and how that Indian Act even determines, who we can be. And, it defines our identity to such a degree that, it can sometimes tear families apart.
Yeah, definitely. Like it definitely has an impact on our on our kinship terms and values. And even then, even community governance. Community governance is a really big thing, and that was taken from us through the Indian Act.
Yes.
Right. And now when I go to certain communities, or when I see with my ceremony family that adopted me, they're in the process of creating a community governance restoration when it comes with clans. And and that'd be something that I would love to see. And that's something that I really wish more youth knew about. Simple thing is knowing what your clan is, and what are the roles and duties and responsibility of your clan. That's something that's so important too, right? Because it involves with our Anishinaabe identity.
Yeah, and we had, you know, our clans served a purpose. So we had a society that functioned very well. And but it was, you know, foreign to, you know, the crown. So we were looked upon as inferior in that sense, even though, you know, the system worked very well and took care of everyone. And I think that was very important. And it should still be very important in our culture today is how we take care of each other and have that respect for that good way of life. And, you know, that's something we have to work on and continue to try and build, you know, those teachings for the youth and, you know, for children. And those are things that I want to teach my grandchildren so they know these pieces of history.
Yes, yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think that's definitely something, in the future tense is to continue with that restoration and the
Yes.
reconciliation. That's definitely what we see. And then to see, not just accept this one biased perspective of treaty, but to see all, the entire story, the entire, all perspectives of treaties, both sides.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for your words, Marlene. Uh, Next up, we're going to go with Christy. Christy, can you answer this question? How has the treaty relationship changed within your lifetime?
Sure, I'd love to. Um, so thank you to the other panelists for sharing. I could relate a lot to everything, to a lot of things that you were both saying and that you were both sharing. Because I think back to as well, when I think about this question, I reflect on my own educational journey and what I learned along the way, or rather did not learn along the way as well. And, I think back to, but I guess to answer the question, I would say things are changing and they're definitely moving in the right direction as far as I can see and in my opinion. Um, I think back to high school, which for me was about 20 years ago. And, I think back to Canadian history in grade 11. And I distinctly remember, knowing that I was First Nation. That was the only part understanding that I had, was that I was First Nation and I had this treaty card. I was disconnected from my Indigenous heritage, history, and family, and I was growing up in a settler with my settler family, knowing that I was First Nation, but not having any idea what that meant, but yet searching for ideas for what that meant. And, coming to Canadian history class in grade 11, and I distinctly remember one page with a picture that showed, a very stereotypical kind of pilgrim and Indian Thanksgiving dinner kind of picture. And I remember looking at it and thinking, is that it? Like it was devastating even at that age, as a young teen, to say, is that all there is to know about my people? That can't be it, right? So thinking to that, there's just no knowledge of treaties. There was no discussion about treaties at that point in time. And then I reflect back on, even 10 years ago when I was finishing my undergraduate degree, and I had the opportunity at my university to take one course on history of Indigenous peoples in Canada. And when I think back on that, I don't even think we talked about treaties in that course either. It was more about wars and, you know, different people and dates. And it was, again, from a very settler perspective. And so I don't recall having any kind of real knowledge and understanding until I went to grad school about 10 years ago. And I deliberately went into Native Studies at the University of Manitoba because it was like, I need to know more. I need to understand. I need to be connected with my community. I need to understand this history and I need to know more about who I am. And that is really where I began learning about treaties myself is, 10 years ago in grad school. And so I would just say, today we notice that there's a lot more kind of broader social discourse on trying to understand what treaties actually are, what they represent, what their significance is. We had Marlene touching on kind of been this gradual kind of movement through society where we see, even in my discipline of Indigenous studies, we see like a real pickup and an uptake. And this is not to take away from all the advocates who came before them, for sure. But we see this real pickup in advocacy in the 1969, 1970s, and we start to see people becoming really vocal about treaties and inherent rights. And we also start to see, just these movements through time where there's changes in court interpretations and more of like looking at historical interpretations of treaties through the 1990s. And the courts are finally deciding to say, hey, we favor the perspectives of Indigenous. We need to look at these and we need to favor the perspectives of Indigenous peoples, how Indigenous peoples would have interpreted these treaties. We also see a lot more education happening, like Marlene, I'm assuming, works for the Treaty Commission of Manitoba. So we have a lot more education out there, a lot of outreach happening. And, I think too, it's been touched on a little bit, but I think there's still a lot more work to do in kind of trying to differentiate between treaty rights and Indian Act legislation. So there's kind of there's this, it's almost like an illusion, right? Like the Indian Act, we're getting more, there's been a growing awareness, but there's still a lot more educating to do around teaching people that the Indian Act is actually this really largely assimilative and genocidal kind of tool of the government. And treaties are actually about our relationship. And as you've mentioned, even Emily, about relationships and sovereignty and self-governance and autonomy and our freedoms and our rights to live in a good way as we see it, as opposed to being under kind of colonial state rule and continually being oppressed by legislation like the Indian Act. And so there's some good movement towards people understanding that, that their treaty card is actually, it doesn't necessarily represent the treaty, it's their status card, and that there's a whole history behind that goes with that as well. And understanding, how divisive that this legislation has been, and that was never the intent of the treaties when our ancestors entered into agreements, even if they didn't want to, or they were forced into kind of entering into these agreements. But there's even longer histories of treaties even before that, right? We have like peace and friendship treaties. We have, economic commercial compact treaties that happened right around the time of, the fur trade. So there's lots of different types of treaties, and we have this really long history and relationship of coming into ceremony and coming into an agreement, right, about how things would benefit both sides, both settlers and Indigenous peoples. And and I see that there is a good movement towards understanding treaties as cornerstone of relationship between settlers and Indigenous peoples, right? There is that movement towards understanding. A lot of people toss out the word reconciliation a lot. And, I prefer to even just, at this point, reconciliation feels like it's lost its charm. And, I prefer to even just talk about writing relationships and how do we write relationships with one another, and how do we even that, our relationship has been so out of balance when it comes to power, when it comes to access to resources, all these other things. And so how do we tip those scales? How do we make things more equal between us? And those are some of the things that I see that people are talking about now, and they're talking about them on a very large kind of social spectrum. Although, like Marlene, I would love to see it become primary and secondary school, is that children are learning about Indian residential schools, which is wonderful. It's great that they're understanding that this happened. As an intergenerational survivor, and my children are intergenerational survivors, this is really important that they learn about this. But then, are they learning about treaties? Are they learning about that aspect of this relationship that they have with Indigenous peoples and with this land that they occupy? And I'll just say one more thing too. I think it's really important. I think this was touched on too, is, and I have, I guess I'm very honored, I guess, to work within post-secondary education institutions that are faith-based. And so I find that one of the tougher things to communicate to a more secular audience is about that spiritual understanding and the treaty as a sacred covenant or agreement or relationship, that it was sacred, right? And that, I think this is one of the most important things, and yet it can be one of the most challenging things if we're talking to people who are not necessarily spiritual, is that understanding that this is a spiritual relationship that was entered into and a spiritual agreement that was entered into, and that it wasn't just an agreement between settlers and First Nations. It was actually an agreement that was made between settlers, First Nations, and the Great Spirit or Creator, or from the settler perspective, the Christian God, right? And that these agreements were made through a pipe ceremony, which we know and understand to be a very sacred process. And that's, I think, the hardest part to communicate to a lot of people, is that understanding that it's also one of the most important things that I feel we need to continue to communicate to people, and help them understand, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Christy, for your words. And that's definitely true. Even then, like, when I think of the word like First Nations, like I'm like, oh, like that's just a political word, right? Like I'm Anishinaabe. When I think of the word Canadian, like, I don't know if that's me. I'm Anishinaabe, right? And like the treaty relationship, like any Anishinaabe relationships, when we created a relationship, even with the Dakota, with the Nehiyaos, with other Indigenous groups, all relationships solidify through ceremony, but also through feast. We had a big feast too, right? And when our ancestors smoked that pipe, Chief Yellowquill, that's my Nidaniko of 7 generations. So I'm his 7th gen grandchild, Nida, I guess it'd be Gidaniko. But and when he created that treaty relationship, it falls through me. And then there's also the differences between a treaty card and a status card, right? And then oftentimes, and it's so like the misconception that that you hear people always say, oh, where's your status card, or my treaty gas and such like that. Like I'm the oldest out of 13. So there's 13 younger siblings, or 12 of them, and I'm the eldest one. And them too, they're starting to say treaty card, and I'm like, I look at them like, it's status card. It's status card. And simple things like that, understanding that First Nation is a given word to us, that we call ourselves Anishinaabe. That is our identity. We are Anishinaabe. I'm an Anishinaabe. Little things like that. And then also, learning the differences between treaty and status cards, learning that we are first level governance, things like that. I feel like those are the key things that we need to, as youth and our future generations, need to learn and understand, because that's what's going to ground us when it comes to having these interactions with other students from universities or in the workplace, knowing who you are as a person, your identity. Right. And that's kind of what I took after from your words, from everything that you've been saying. And and when you're in high school too, how you had to go through that. Like, that's awful how they only just it kind of reminds me of, those like Hollywood movies where they just like embed Native Americans with like a ton of stereotypes. It's awful, that's not how we choose to be showcased. And not only then, like, did they even consult Indigenous peoples when it comes to history class? They are on our land, right? Canada doesn't own this land. We No one owns this land. We are the caretakers of this land, but as them, like, they should be, consulting us, especially when it comes to education, right? And so when it comes to us as treaty, I guess First Nations as treaty um solidified, our treaty relationship with, the settlers, and then in tied with creator, that's something too that we should definitely start, bringing up, is that spirituality is so important. It's so important. I want to personally say that it's probably one of the greatest factors to know about treaties, is that spirituality perspective. Because, as us as treaty, I guess we want to say First Nations, but as a treaty Anishinaabe, I know it's my responsibility and it's my duty to respect the treaty agreement and to follow through, because I know that my Nidaniko, Chief Yellowquill, he smoked his pipe, the black pipe with the three birds. But thank you for your words, Christy. And again, like, this is a ton of information. I really hope that people are watching or are taking notes, and they're listening very closely, because again, like, it's not often that we get to talk about this, but even, like, at a public scale, because treaty too, it's often underlooked when it should be, it should be known. Everyone should know this, because we are all treaty people. So for the second part, in this section, we're going to ask what the future of the treaty relationship is in Southern Manitoba. So once again, panelists, you're welcome to answer. There's 3 questions. So how about if I give a question to each panelist? Does that sound good? So each panelist will have a new question,
Sure.
and then could, if anyone wants to add or comment, then go ahead. So we're gonna go back with Allen. The first question, you're gonna get your question, and Marlene and Christy, if you want to add on, feel free to. So this is the question: as an ancestor, what would you share with your future descendants about the treaty relationship?
I'm glad that you're giving me that question, because that was exactly the question that we had as we gathered with a sacred fire on August 20th in Riding Mountain. What kind of ancestor are you going to be? Because our ancestors 150 years ago deliberated long through ceremony. Do we welcome these newcomers? Do we share our territory with them? It's not an easy thing to do. But through ceremonies, they realize if they don't try to protect their nationhood as a people, that they could very well get lost in the upcoming storm. Because at that time in 1860s, there was a lot of things that were going on with the wars, with they call Indian wars in the south of our border. But more and more people were showing up all the time. And it was your ancestors, along with the Anishinaabe, all those fires on the west side of Lake Manitoba with the Cree, agreed that nobody goes west until there's a treaty. Now we were practicing our sovereignty, and that's an English word, but it's our autonomy. It's our God-given rights. I'm just using English language here. But we were practicing our sovereignty before we made treaty. During treaty, we made treaty with not made, but entered into treaty with the newcomers after hearing what they wanted. He says, "Can we live with you? And if every land pick up, we'll compensate you." But it was very clear, you will have your own laws and customs, we will have our own laws and customs. So all that was tied to the Wampum Belts, tied to the Anishinaabe British 1764 agreement, and all the other peace and friendship treaties leading up to 1871. Now, going beyond 1871, we are still sovereign nations, but what changed the fact? What changed everything? What they were supposed to, on the Queen's orders, be equitable, be fair dealing, and compensate for every land taken up. But what changed? The settlers' government did not want to honor those treaties. They didn't want to follow the direct orders from the Queen, from the Crown. They didn't want to share. So 5 years later, after 1871, they created the Indian Act. In the process, have turned us into the wars of Canada. That is why today we have the Indian Act. We are still going to be the wars of Canada. Reconciliation will never be completed as long as that Indian Act is still around. As long as we're under the tutelage of the settler governments under Indian affairs. The spirit and intent was one nation made a treaty with another nation. So we remind ourselves that we're still sovereign nations even after 150 years. But we need to educate allies, to bring them in, educate Canadians to say, you've been lied to falsely all this time for 150 years, when the spirit and intent was all about sharing. Now you're grieving along with us because of the graves that are found. But the thing is, people are losing the message. It's the Indian Act, Indian Affairs, and that department that brought in Indian residential schools and all these other colonial policies and laws. And it still exists to this day. And I've been telling officials of Canada, especially when they're going into this election, in 5 years from now, are we going to be, you Canadians, are you going to celebrate the fact that you got a human rights violation, a human legislation and law called the Indian Act? And I know why they don't want to get rid of it, because when they in turn made us wars of Canada, they did not want to share. So they owe us billions. And that's going to hurt Canadians. But it's just like anything else. You got a free ride, you got a credit card, you got a free ride, but now the bill needs to be paid. And it's going to hurt. So when we talk about reconciliation, it's not enough to know the truth and trying to reconcile this. Is that the last piece that was lost from Nelson Mandela was, it must be healing. Because even in our communities that have been colonized in Treaty 2 territory still struggles because we need to heal each other. We're still in a colonial period. We still don't, education to say that we're still sovereign nations, still a lot of work needs to be done there. But we are sovereign nations within Canada. We help build Canada. Now, get out of the way and let us look after ourselves. There's only 18% Crown land in Treaty 2. And we're saying enough already. We want our parks back, provincial, federal, and our Crown land. And we want to look after our people, not on reserves, but the whole territory. Anyway, First Nations of Treaty 2 territory is taking all the action to make that happen. Enough talk already. We are now doing everything we can to get us where we're supposed to be 150 years ago. Miigwech.
Thank you for your words, Alan. I really hope everyone's listening and tuning in because, like what you spoke, Alan, is so true on so many levels. And it's true. Like, it was the Indian Act, it really, like it freaking put us in a hole. But not only that, when they created the Indian Act, there's the Indian Trust Fund. The Indian Trust Fund is sitting at $3 trillion. And what do you think Canada's been using? Like, it's in trust with Canada, but Canada's been using that money and Canada's in debt. We're running a little bit behind schedule, and I wish I could just carry on this conversation with you, Allen, because you spoke the truth. That is the truth, and we can't hide from the truth. We have to face the truth, and then we have to start working on healing from that intergenerational trauma, but working towards abolishing the Indian Act. We also still have a lot to work to do on our end, right? Making sure that we're ready for that abolishment of the Indian Act. So Christy, yeah, we're gonna go with Christy. So I have a question for you. Are treaties relevant to First Nation individuals and families who live in urban areas?
I would certainly hope so, although sometimes it doesn't necessarily feel like it as much because we just honestly I've been an urban Indian my whole life. I have visited many communities. I have been to my own home community several times, including for treaty days, not this year, but and I've been to several communities. I've traveled all over First Nation communities in Manitoba, but and we see the disparities. We see the disparities of how people live in their home communities that they love and cherish, where their families are. And, and then we see also disparities even within the urban centers too. And we see, the differences in how people live in urban centers as well. And so I mean, I think it's hard sometimes as somebody who's lived in the city almost my whole life to really truly grasp and understand what it's like to live on reserve and how different it would be to either not in the housing situation or not having economic opportunities or jobs to necessarily go to, or having to leave the community to go to school to get education, sometimes even for high school. These are things that we don't necessarily think about living in an urban setting. But the treaties should be equally important to us because these are our kin, these are our relations. And so I guess just picking up too on the Indian Act, as somebody who lives in an urban area, the Indian Act doesn't impact my life necessarily as much as it does to someone who's living on reserve, who would be under that legislation and live their lives under that legislation a lot more. But as somebody who lives in an urban area, those are my kin, those are my relations, and I absolutely care. And it does matter to me how my relatives are living. It also matters to me that, every day when I drive by, how I see my relatives living in the city, and that the majority of, the homeless, the people who don't have homes in their own homeland, are my relatives. They're our relatives. And that matters to me too. And so, I mean, they are relevant to us. They should be relevant to us because we are all connected and we are all, if honestly, the treaties, and we're talking a lot about the spirit and intent. The treaties were entered into with this idea that, okay, well, if it's, this will be okay as long as it's good for everyone. If it's not good for everyone, then it's probably not going to be okay. And that gets lost, I think, sometimes too in these discussions, and that it affects us differently living in urban areas for sure, but we should definitely be paying a lot of attention to what's happening in reserve communities as urban people too.
Yes, thank you for your words, Christy. And it's definitely true too. Regardless if we live, in a city or not, we're still treaty First Nations. And it's, we still have family back home in our communities. And regardless of that, you know, even though, as someone in an urban area isn't quite affected by the Indian Act, we still are affected regardless. Right. It may not be, as much as someone who lives on reserve. We still are affected.
We still are, and especially as women too, right? Because when we think about, if the treaties really were intended so that we could all live a good life, so we could all live the minimum the good life, and the Indian Act is actually determining which of us belong to community and don't, and that women still are, have lost status historically, and our children are losing status and not being considered Indian enough under colonial legislation. Like, these are still problems that affect everybody, regardless of where you live as well too. But definitely, my heart goes every time I go visit in communities. My heart is always just for the people, who love where they live, who love their home, who have a love for the land and for their community, right? But you see these disparities and just wonder, well, I'm quite certain that that was not within the spirit and intent that our ancestors entered into, that there would be no infrastructure, that on very little infrastructure on reserves, that there'd be very little opportunities to kind of create and have working kinds of roles and positions and different things happening within our communities that happen outside of them, on a much larger scale. Like, I'm quite certain that that was not the agreement that we were looking to get into. And so, yeah, I care deeply about treaty implementation and what the Indian Act has actually done in community.
Yeah, miigwech for your words, Christy. I think we're still running on behind schedule a little bit. Again, these are really great discussions to have too, and it's very relevant to us as it affects us every day. Next up, we're gonna go with Marlene. Marlene, so here's a big question. You get the big question. How do you see the relationship changing or evolving in the next 7 generations?
That is a big question. And I think it kind of relates to the other questions in a sense too, because I think, the treaty relationship itself is always going to be changing. And I think it's something that we'll continue to need working on. And so future generations are definitely, going to have to work at building that relationship, but also make sure that the treaties are being acknowledged and that the rights of the people are being acknowledged and respected as to why the treaties were agreed upon to begin with. And part of that would need building partners, and because they will need that support into the future from their communities, from the elders, but you also need those settler allies to help you push your agenda forward, to make sure that all of these things are being acknowledged. And we know with you were talking about the status card, that itself is going to really impact the identity of future generations, because we know that the changes they made now, how it impacts the women who have married non-Indigenous men, and it gets cut off 2 generations after. So it's really going to impact them. And I think the whole plan of that is, of course, to reduce the number of people who are status in Canada. And to me, that's been something that's been in the works, I think, for some time. And so, but the other piece to all of that too is what I would say to future descendants is, never lose connection to the land, never lose connection to, what your ancestors did. Because, I remember someone asking me one time why it was important, why are the treaties important and why does it matter if you have status? And my response was, well, number one, you need to learn the history of who we are as Indigenous people. And for me, it is important to have that status because I know the sacrifices that my ancestors went through, right? For us to be where we are today, it's important to acknowledge what they had to do in their lifetime for us to be where we are. So then I would want to be, a person who helps the next 7 generations to be able to achieve the goals that are going to be needed for them in that lifetime. And part of that is going to be, collaboration, finding new ways to work together within our Indigenous communities, but also with the settler communities, right? Because we are all, treaty people, as we've said in the past. So I think that's important to maintain that. And I would say that it's going to take patience. It's going to take a lot of work. And I hope that we are, instilling the skills and the knowledge and everything for that generation to be able to do that. And, when I say the connection to land, going to the ceremonies like you were talking about, being able to do that, because for a time, a lot of our ancestors couldn't even do that. It was taken away from them because of the Indian Act and the Indian Agent and so forth. So I think it was, to reconnect with the land, to know who you are is going to help them. And yes, the direction that the treaty relationship is going to take, it's going to be significant and it's going to have implications in the future for, for that foundation that we've been trying to build. But also, we need to work towards an amicable relationship for all Canadians, because we need them to understand our perspective. And that's why for me, it's important working for the Treaty Commission and working on all the education initiatives that they put forth to educate everyone in the schools. I remember when it first started years ago, people were like, oh yeah, that's for just the Indigenous kids. No. This is for everyone to learn, right? Everyone should learn this piece of history. It's not just Indigenous history, it's Canadian history. It doesn't matter how dark a chapter it was. We all need to understand what happened and why we have situations that we have today. And that includes all our people, whether they live on reserve or urban. They are all part of our nation, and we need to respect that.
Thank you much for your words, Marlene. Like I'm very much into business and economic development, socioeconomic development too. That's my thing. And I'm in on reserve. Like I'm from the rest. But like one thing too, like when I do like my reports and when I do my research, First Nations economy is 25 years behind Canada's economy, which is that's decades. That's decades. And we live in these third world conditions, but not only that, we're the fastest growing population, and there's a housing crisis in our communities, right? It's so difficult for us to get a house, and we're very limited. And not only that, if you were to look at reports from housing needing in major and minor repairs, like it's pretty high compared to in the city of Winnipeg, or in a town such as Somerset, which is right outside of Swan Lake First Nation. It's if you do a comparison, like you can see that we are struggling, economically and stuff, and therefore a lot of our people are moving into urban areas.
Yeah.
So I really liked how you mentioned how we have to, keep going back to the land, keep practicing our ceremonies, learning how to be able to walk in two worlds. Because if I think about like I'm a youth myself, but if I think about, future 7 generations, a lot of our people are going to be living in urban areas. But in order to stay, to keep up with, I don't know how to say it, but in order to, have our identity, to carry our identity, to be Anishinaabe, we're going to have to really support our youth, whether it's to, host land-based camps, culture camps, to invite them to ceremonies, to, to bring them back into our land and to practice these land-based um, activities or in these things, learning what ethnobotany is, right? Our medicines and stuff. And even like our language is huge. How am I supposed to call myself Anishinaabe when I don't even know Anishinaabemowin? Like that's a real thing, right? And one thing too that my aunt always says, she friends me, she's a Swanik, is that she says, as long as you know who you are, then you're good. Know who you are. Be true to yourself, right? Yeah. So as myself, as a youth, as a 20-year-old, youth from Swan Lake First Nation, well, if I'm going to be true to myself, if I'm going to be Anishinaabe, to have that, to carry that identity, I'm going to have to keep up with my roles and responsibilities, whether it's to know, what my clan is and to follow, my responsibility as a bear clan, as Makwa Indodem. I'm going to have to learn the language and start taking part of these ceremonies. We have our societies. We do. And we need to keep up with these societies, keep up with that community governance restoration and, learning our language, but also, building ourselves building our economy and learning to become economists in our community, supporting our communities so that we can get out of that rut, that 25 years behind our economy rut, so that we're able to support our people, so that we are a nation. But how are we supposed to be a nation if we're struggling to feed our people, to give our resources to the people so that they could be able to live healthy, not in third world conditions? That's our responsibilities too. And we kind of, we could definitely point the blame at people, but how are we, that's not going to do anything at the end of the day. We need to start being hard workers again. And a lot of that, and a lot of us stopped being hard workers when welfare came, the implementation of welfare, right? Even things from the Indian Act, taking away from our ceremonies is a lot of work. Yeah. It made us hard workers. Even like learning how to tan hides, being land-based, when they took that away from us, a part of us being hard workers, we lost that too. And it's time for us to start being hard workers again and to start carrying our identity at all times, because that's how we're going to be able to evolve and to be able to still be Anishinaabe within the next 7 generations. So we just have enough time for this final. We're going to have to, I don't know, keep it short. But in this final section, we're going to discuss how we can involve ourselves in this treaty relationship. So this question, what are some things we can do now to ensure a healthy treaty relationship and treaty rights into the future? Allen, did you want to answer this?
Yeah. It was interesting to say that you're talking about ceremonies. We did a ceremonies this morning. I'm the Earth Lodge Keeper of Treaty 2 territory, and we use the Earth Lodge to guide us in all our ceremonies, all our research, all our understanding of everything. So you can find us at lodge.fnt2t.com just to understand how we are marching towards self-determination. This morning the question was, if not now, when? Because what the ceremony was at one of our circles, and we're organized by circles and our clans, but a modernized way. It's not trying to inherit the system, Western system out there, but to create our own that is reflective of our ancestors' way of doing things. Anyway, we don't call it CFS, we say Child Family Nation. What was important about this was a youth created a logo for us, and that's taking back our own destiny. And the picture there are these 6 beautiful children are looking inside of a ceremony of 4 feathers, of eagle feathers. And I knew right away what that youth was creating, because in the middle is the next child to come. All our society always protect the fire keepers, the next children to come. We're all organized that way. That's our strength as a society. So we did the ceremony. It says, this is now the seed of our self-determination. We'll plant that seed, we'll nourish it, it'll become ours. We're not going to replant a tree that's broken or doesn't work for us. It's a dead tree. We're creating our own. So getting back to your question is about, we got to do it now. 150 years ago, our ancestors knew a great change, a storm coming. It brought us here to this day. Now the question is, what kind of ancestors are you going to be? We don't have the luxury of 150 years from now when the threat to ourselves and our planet is immediate. So what is our treaty relationship going to be in the next 5 years? Never mind 150 years. So the time of now of action is today. And we all need to get on board on this. Now, this is a very short message, but I'll just finish by saying that 150 years ago, we got together and we shook hands and he said that we'd be brothers and sisters and we'll become one. We all share the same sun, the same grass, the same water flows. We also share the same God. The only difference is our worldview. When our philosophy is to look after our Mother Earth, that's what needs to be spread. That message needs to be told to all Canadians. This is what we got to do now. It's to protect not only our planet, but ourselves. And treaty is everything. Because this is binding 150 years ago is just as binding us today. That is my short message. Miigwech.
Miigwech for your words, Allen. You know, I really wish we could continue on this conversation, but that just means that we need to continue having this conversation, right? Continue these discussions. Marlene, would you like to answer this question? What are some things we can do now to ensure a healthy treaty relationship and treaty rights into the future?
Well, I think one of the things is to create dialogue. Continue to work together, building on that relationship. I mean, that's a big part of the Treaty Relations Commission is building that relationship and ensuring that, we bring an awareness about what the treaties are about, in that dialogue, and it doesn't matter who we're talking to, it should be an important piece. And we've all talked about, the legal part of it and the 2 perspectives that are involved with treaties, and for me, I guess I still go back to the awareness for all Canadians about treaties through education. And, the one area that was lacking for a long time was in the area of citizenship. We bring in a lot of people into Canada, immigrants from different parts of the world, and we didn't have anything in place for a lot of them to learn about who Indigenous people were. So it's just recent where they have actually started to include pieces, about citizenship, who are Indigenous people. And I have spoken to, probably over half a dozen or more just in the last couple years on groups where, they have newcomers. Some have been here maybe 3-4 years, but they're wanting to know who we are because they hear things. And unfortunately, they don't always hear the good things. So we need to educate them so they learn, the good things about us. And of course, when you talk about the treaty rights, we know they are constitutionally protected, but yet we do lose some of those rights every year. And, I think it impacts our elders when certain medicines aren't covered and things like that, when they should be taken care of, right? Because that was part of the agreement with the treaties. So the other piece, when you were talking about, the poor housing and everything, those are some outstanding issues that still need to be addressed. We have water issues in a lot of our communities where they're having to boil water. The housing is deplorable, and it would take probably trillions. There was a report several years back that said it would take trillions of dollars to fix the housing issues on reserves, right? And our people can't live there, so we're moving into the urban centers. And health is another one where we shouldn't be behind in any of these things. We should be taken care of, and our health and everything should be equal to the rest of Canadians. So to me, I think it's important that there should be a true commitment from the government, right? And to work with Indigenous people for us to be taken care of in the way that we were supposed to be. But what I would say to the youth as well is make sure you exercise those rights that came with the treaties, because a lot of times they're forgotten, and talking about the status, it can take over a year for a child to get their status card. It shouldn't be taking over a year. I know of one lady I was talking to when I was teaching a course back in the spring. Her child is almost 4 years old, and she's still struggling to get him a status card that he's entitled to. That shouldn't be happening. We shouldn't have to be waiting that long for rights that should be ours. But yet at the same time, our leaders need to fight for those sorts of things as well. They need to be out there and say, this shouldn't be happening. No one should have to wait that long. Can you imagine waiting that long for a Manitoba health card? To be able to use it to go see a doctor? But yet for this, it seems okay that we have to wait. So I think the other part on all of this is we have to recognize the calls to action, right? From the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And to me, I think true commitment is going to go a long way. And we need to work on
English, Marlene. And it's really true too, because I know a few people. I have one, there's actually a girl my age, and she still hasn't received her status card yet. And I have a couple nephews too. They're toddlers and they haven't received theirs yet. And it's honestly sickening, because those are our rights. You don't see that happening with anything else. Sad to say, but my parents' house burnt down, a few months ago, and guarantee, luckily she grabbed, her purse, and it had all of my siblings' IDs and stuff and their health records. But guarantee, it doesn't take years to get a driver's license or a Manitoba health card or anything else, or even a social insurance number. It doesn't take years to even get the COVID card too. So why is it taking years just to get our status cards, just to be recognized as a status Indian? These are our rights, and it's definitely true. Exercise your treaty rights as much as you can, as much as possible, because you are entitled and you have the right to have those rights. It's right from birth.
Even renewal cards take almost a year. So you have to go a year in advance. And, I remember, if you look back far enough, we had status cards that didn't expire. The only thing that would have changed would be your picture as you aged, right? Mm-hmm. But now I always say, well, now they put an expiry date on us you don't apply, your card is expired, although they'll still, I guess, accept it in most places. But I just think that's kind of ironic that we have to wait that long for our cards. And like you said, it is one of our rights, and we shouldn't have to wait that long.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Next up, we're going to go with Christy. Christy, what are some things we can do now to ensure a healthy treaty relationship and treaty rights into the future?
I just want to say I really appreciate both Alan and Marlene's contributions to this conversation, and yourself too, Emily. It's just been really awesome to hear from all of you and hear your perspectives. Um, you know, I'm going to switch gears just a little bit and just talk for just briefly, because we've been talking a lot too about just like kind of Indigenous and settler relations, which is a big part of that treaty relationship and a big part of the education and educating all Canadians and all of that. And I think it's really important. But I just wanted to say too, because we have also touched on self-governance, self-determination, and autonomy as being key to healthy treaty relationships as well. And that, you know, the autonomy and the freedom to determine for ourselves what is good for us as nations and for our people. And I just want to speak really briefly because I can't be in these conversations without reminding people that even still in 2021, um, although there is some diversity in those discussions, that we also still see primarily in our own communities Indigenous men that are in charge of these negotiations, which are a long-term consequence of the Indian Act, right? Like of being pushed out of being able to hold political office or vote in elections as Indigenous women. And I just think that, you know, moving forward and moving into these kind of as we move forward into more of these discussions and action, as Alan has reminded us, action that we need to take in order to, you know, to move our initiatives forward, that women and two-spirit LGBTQ persons and our youth need to be included in these conversations and need to be included in our movements forward. We have great youth like yourself, Emily, who are very outspoken and intelligent and have so much to add to our conversation. You're passionate. You have so much to add to this dialogue and to this conversation, and you need to be included in these. You know, diversity and our representation is also key to creating our healthy treaty relationships within our own communities too. And I just think we need to kind of shift our understanding and our perception of what leadership looks like, because some of the greatest leaders that we see today out in the front lines and, you know, doing this work and speaking out about things, about injustices and fighting for what's right for our people, have virtually no power in decision making. And I think that that needs to change as well. So as we're kind of continuing to negotiate these treaty rights, our inherent treaty rights, I think we need to remember to be inclusive and to make sure that we have a lot of voices that are being heard, and to diversify the people who sit at tables where decisions are made and where the decisions where the power sits, right, in those negotiations with the settler colonial state and with our allies and everyone else too. Thank you.
And it's true. We're our clan mothers. Our clan mothers need to be present. And also that, like, you know, hopefully, like, you know, in the near future, more and more women take the stand in being leadership and continue that, again, community governance restoration. But also, you know, it is, you know, as women, it is, you know, we have that right to be in leadership, and now that's how it was before the Indian Act and before the treaty relationship. It was our clan mothers, you know, they were our leaders, and we need to start working towards that. And even then, like, uplifting our women. Just to quickly add, because I know we're behind schedule, but I had went to our healing camp in Swan Lake, and my cuckoo, she goes, I haven't seen her all summer because I've been, you know, away traveling, attending events. But she said, Emily, she's like, I love that you're traveling, and I love how you have, you know, such a strong voice, and you can, you know, you're very confident. She's like, but Emily, she's like, if you could please, you know, bring some of our women from our community with you, because they're not that as confident as you, and help make them confident. You know, and that really stuck by me, because it's true. Like, I can't, you know, even as myself, like, I can't be, you know, just the only one. I have to start bringing people, you know, to shadow me, or to, you know, listen, or to try to push them into these conversations as well. It can't just be one person. we have to uplift each other, right? And but yeah, thank you for your words, Christy. Anyways, unfortunately, we have to end our conversation here. For those who had questions and we weren't able to get to, the NCTR will be posting the video alongside along as well as a blog with all questions that the panelists are going to answer, I believe. On behalf of the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, I would like to say miigwech to Allen Sutherland, Christy Anderson, and Marlene Gallagher for joining us today. And what is best means for the audience members to get in contact with you through email, I'm guessing. Yeah.
Well, me and Marlene, we're part of the Speakers Bureau for the Treaty Relations Commission in Manitoba. That's a good place to start.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you can contact us there.
Perfect. What about you, Christy? What's the best way to contact you?
Probably through email. I can
Through
leave that with
email?
you. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, we'll have that shared. And people can get in touch with me on my social media, Émilie McKinney. Just shoot me a message. It should be easy to find. But if not, there's also my business, Anishinaabe Bemishimo. I'm the one who manufactures the jingle cones. So you should be able to find me. If not, then contact NCTR. But again, miigwech to our audience for joining us today. Watch for news on our next NCTR dialogue happening in October, which will be a discussion on 60s scoop and child and family services. I hope to see you all there. And again, this was a really good conversation and a really good topic. I hope we can talk about this more often in the near future. Miigwech, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Have a good day.
Goodbye. Miigwech.